The snow had crusted over in the night hard as hammered tin beneath her boots. Wind moved across the empty plains in sheets, lifting dry powder into the air like breath off a dying horse. She stood at the edge of the town's dirt road, her shawl pulled tight, her hands raw and red. No one came out to meet her. The town of Willow's Rest was no more than 2 rows of crooked buildings leaning against a sky too wide to hold. A church with a missing steeple. A store whose windows were thick with dust and silence. One saloon with the door hanging off one hinge. Somewhere behind it a dog barked once and went quiet again. She carried her youngest on her hip. Her other 3 children walked behind, silent and thin as fence rails. Their faces were wind-chapped lips, cracked eyes sunk deep. The oldest boy, maybe 10, had his jaw set the same as his father's had been the last time she saw him, right before the ground swallowed him whole. That was 3 weeks ago. A mining cave in near Leadville. No body, just a folded coat and the word of a foreman who wouldn't look her in the eye. They had walked most of the way, hitched one ride on a broken cart for a few miles until the mule collapsed in the cold. Ate what little she could carry, then what little she could find. She'd sold her wedding ring back in Boone, traded it for bread and dried apples. The saloon keeper had stared at her hand too long before dropping the coins on the counter. She was tired, deep in the bone, but her eyes were still sharp as glass. The general store bell jangled when she opened the door. Inside, the warmth barely reached past the stove at the back. Shelves stood mostly bare. One man behind the counter, thumbing through a worn ledger, didn't look up until her voice cracked. "I got 4 children," she said. "We need food, just until I can find work." He looked her over like she'd asked for whiskey and a miracle. "You got money?" Her throat bobbed. "No." "Then I can't help you." One of the children coughed behind her. The littlest one whimpered, too tired to cry proper. She turned to leave. That's when a voice from the corner said, "How much?" The cowboy had been sitting there the whole time behind a crate of nails and bolts, his hat low over his face. He stood now slow, as if his limbs weighed more than his body. Tall, rough-coated, maybe 30. His boots made a sound like thunder in the quiet room. The storekeeper shrugged. $10 would get him through the week. The cowboy reached into his coat. "Give him 2 weeks' worth." Everyone stood still, even the children. He didn't say anything else, just laid the money on the counter and turned toward the door. She followed, something in her chest cracking wide with every step. Not because of what he gave, but how he gave it. Like it meant nothing and everything. "Sir," she called after him, voice breaking on the word. "Please help my family." He stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, the wind tossing the hem of his coat. He turned, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked at her for a long time, then at the children. The silence of the town deepened, as if it too were waiting. "I just did," he said. Then he tipped his hat and walked down the road. Behind her, a woman opened the saloon door to let her children come in from the cold. The saloon smelled of tobacco and old wood and spilled whiskey, but it was warm. A rusted stove in the corner snapped and hissed heat bleeding out into the worn floorboards. The children clustered near it, shivering with relief, their cheeks blooming red again. She crouched beside them, rubbing their hands, trying not to cry where they could see. The woman who'd let them in handed over a blanket, then disappeared behind the bar. No questions, no smile. Just a quick glance at the children and a quiet understanding. In this part of the world, survival was a kind of language. It didn't need words. She stayed there for what might have been an hour, maybe more. Long enough for the youngest to fall asleep against her shoulder, long enough for the oldest to stop flinching at the sound of boots on the saloon floor. Then she stood. Out the window, snow had begun again, thin flakes drifting sideways, lazy and cruel. The town hadn't changed. Still empty. still waiting for spring or death, whichever came first. She wrapped the children in what she could and stepped back into the cold. A man in a black coat watched from across the street. He leaned against a post like he'd grown from it, arms crossed, smoke curling from the cigarette in his mouth. He didn't speak, didn't nod. Just watch. She walked anyway. The cowboy was easy to find. A barn sat behind the livery half-collapsed door hanging open like a mouth missing teeth. He was inside alone, brushing down a thick sorrel horse. The creature snorted and pawed the earth, steam rising from its nose. She stood in the doorway until he spoke. "You don't owe me thanks. I wasn't offering it," she said. He paused, brushing slow. "Then what are you offering?" She stepped inside. Her shoes sank into old straw. "I'm not looking for pity or saving." He looked at her then. Really looked. His eyes were the color of river rock, cold, smooth, not easy to read. "I can work," she said. "Laundry, cooking, sewing if the seams ain't too fine. I don't break easy. Neither do my children." The horse nickered. He turned back to it, but his voice had softened. "You planning on staying?" She thought about that. Got nowhere else. A long silence broken only by the horse chewing and the wind rattling the barn slats. Finally he said, "There's an old shack behind the church. Roof leaks, but it's standing. You clean it out, you can sleep there?" She nodded. "You chop your own wood?" "I know how." "You work for your food?" "I'll earn more than I eat." His hand stilled on the horse's flank. "I believe you." She didn't move. "What's your name?" he asked. "Clara." He nodded, once thoughtful. "Matthew." He didn't offer a handshake. Neither did she. But something passed between them then. Not warmth exactly, but the shape of it waiting to be filled. She turned to leave, then paused. "Why'd you help me?" she asked. His voice was quiet, almost lost in the rattle of the wind. "Because someone didn't." She didn't ask more. That night she swept out the shack with a broken broom, patched the roof with canvas from the church's cellar, and built a fire that smoked for hours before catching clean. The children curled beneath one blanket, pressed together like pups. She sat beside them, watching the flames, her fingers cracked and bleeding, but steady. Outside, snow fell harder. The town held its breath. The fire dims, not dies. Subscribe and stay. Morning came with a brittle light and wind sharp enough to split skin. Clara rose before it touched the floorboards, slipped her feet into stiff boots, and stepped outside with the axe Matthew had left leaning against her door. The woodpile was small, mostly scrap and deadfall, but it would do. She worked until her shoulders ached, her hands throbbed. The blade bit into the frozen logs with a stubborn rhythm, each strike a kind of prayer. Not for mercy, just for another day. By the time the children woke, smoke already curled from the chimney and the shack smelled faintly of warmth. She gave them each a crust of bread and a sip of boiled water, then bundled them in what clothes they had and set off toward the livery. Matthew was already there, as though he never left. Shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, sweat streaking through the dust on his forearm. He didn't speak when she entered, just nodded toward the pails by the trough. She fed the horses, cleaned the stalls, hauled water from the pump down the slope, slipping twice and biting her lip until it bled to keep from cursing. By mid-morning her back was screaming and her fingers were numb again, but she didn't stop. Matthew finally looked over. "You ever ride?" She straightened, breathing hard. "Not in a long time." "Then you'll learn again." He swung up onto the saddle of a black gelding, tossed her the reins of a smaller roan. She stared at it a moment, then stepped forward and mounted. Her legs remembered. So did her spine. They rode out into the hills where the land rolled and dipped like a sea of frozen waves. Bare cottonwoods clawed at the sky. Prairie dogs scattered before them. The roan was jumpy, untested, but Clara held steady. Matthew didn't speak much, but when he did, it wasn't useless. He pointed out fence lines, told her where the coyotes ran, which springs went dry by June. He didn't offer comfort, just facts. It was better that way. They returned before dusk. The children met her at the edge of the shack, eyes bright, cheeks flushed with the cold. Her eldest held a bundle of twigs, proud of the kindling he'd gathered. She kissed his head just once, and he ducked his face in embarrassment. That night she cooked a stew from dried beans and a strip of salted pork the storekeeper handed over without a word. She didn't ask why. Sometimes pity wears the face of trade. The days began to fall into rhythm. Work before sunrise, cold meals, long hours at the livery, or clearing snow evenings crowded around the fire. Her hands grew rougher, her eyes sharper. The children began to laugh again, soft and shy, like something half-remembered. One morning, after 2 weeks, Matthew handed her a letter. The paper was creased, edges worn. "Your name's on it," he said. She stared at it. "Who sent it?" He shrugged. "Came through the post yesterday." Her hands shook as she opened it. She read the first line, then stopped, folded it once, slipped it inside her coat. Matthew didn't ask. Later, while brushing down one of the mares, she said, "It was from my husband's sister. Wants the children. Says I can't raise them proper out here." He didn't look up, just kept brushing. "She's got a house, money, a school not 20 feet from her door." Still, he said nothing. Clara's voice cracked, quiet and bitter. She said, "A woman without a man's no better than a loose board. Said I'd break, and when I did, the children fall with me." Matthew finally set the brush down. "You ain't a board," he said. "You're the wall." She turned away fast. Her breath hitched sharp and sudden. That night, the wind moaned around the shack, but Clara slept with her arms wrapped around all 4 of her children, and her body didn't shake. March came with mud. The snow melted in heavy drips, turning the roads into slow rivers of thaw and grit. Boots stuck in the ruts, horses stumbled, wagons sank to their axles. But the air softened. The wind smelled of wet soil instead of ice. For the first time in weeks, Clara let her youngest walk without a blanket over her head. They called it the break, those weeks between winter's dying breath and spring's first green. Nothing bloomed yet. Nothing sang. But the earth loosened its fists just a little. She spent her days working alongside Matthew. He didn't ask more than she could give, and she never offered less. They repaired fences, scrubbed tack, cleaned out the feed bins, and drove cattle down to the creek, where ice still clung to the edges like ghosts that wouldn't let go. He never spoke about his past, not directly, but she learned to listen in the pauses. There was a photograph in the tack room, faded from sun and time. 2 boys, one older one, small, standing in front of a barn door. A woman's arm wrapped around them, but her face was turned. Clara didn't ask who they were. One morning, while sorting bridles, she heard him singing under his breath. Just a line. Something about a river and a name he hadn't spoken before. "Who's Annie?" she asked. He paused, just for a beat. "Then my sister. What happened to her?" His hands kept moving. "She died." "How?" "She stayed." Clara didn't press further. They kept working. Later that evening, he came to the shack with a bundle of seeds. "For the back patch," he said, "when the ground's ready." She looked at the packet: beans, onions, carrots. "Not much, but enough. You're giving me a garden now." "Not giving. Lending, dending. You'll pay it back come harvest." Clara smiled, small and tired. "You always this generous with strangers." "You're not a stranger anymore." It hit her like a stone in the chest. Not because of the words, but the way he said them, plain and sure, like they were already true. That night, after the children had fallen asleep, she stepped outside. The sky was cloudless, the stars like shattered ice. She sat on the porch step, arms wrapped around her knees. He was already there, leaning against the side of the shack. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "I dreamed too loud." He nodded like he understood. She glanced over. "What do you dream about?" He hesitated. "A creek that ran near my mother's house. Coldest water you ever felt. Used to fish there when I was little." She tilted her head. "You miss it." "Sometimes. Not enough to go back." The silence between them was not empty. It was thick with the weight of everything they didn't say. Grief, maybe. Hope buried under all that mud. Clara looked toward the hills. "You ever think about leaving?" "Used to. And now, I'm waiting to see what stays." She turned to him, then slow. His face was in shadow, but she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his hand curled slightly at his side. She wanted to say something. "Thank you, maybe. Or I see you." Instead, she said, "You ever eat rabbit stew with corn and sage?" He smiled without showing teeth. "Can't say I have." "Well," she said, standing, brushing off her skirts, "you just might someday." And for the first time since she'd arrived in Willow's Rest, Clara laughed. Not loud. Not long. But real. Spring came slow, dragging its heels through the mud and frost-bitten soil. The hills stayed brown longer than they should have, and the cottonwoods didn't leaf out until late April. But the garden behind the shack sprouted green, thin shoots, at first shy and crooked but alive. Clara planted it with care, rose straight seeds tucked in like prayers. The children helped when they could, pulling weeds and stomping clods of dirt flat under bare heels. The youngest liked to name the plants as they grew, called the carrots Eliza, the beans Tom. It made them laugh, and that was enough reason to keep doing it. Matthews stopped by most evenings now. Sometimes he brought a saddle to repair or a bag of grain to carry, but more often he came with nothing at all. Just leaned against the post outside her door and watched the children play. He never came inside. Not yet. But his presence felt less like a stranger's and more like something steady. A rock in the river, keeping shape no matter the current. One evening in May, Clara found herself standing beside him in the soft dusk, watching her eldest haul water from the pump with both hands. "He's strong," Matthew said. "He had to be," she answered. "After Sam died, he wouldn't speak for a week. Just sat by the door like he was waiting to hear boots." Matthew was quiet a long while. "I buried my father when I was 12, he said at last. "He was shot over a game of cards. My mother packed what we had and moved us west the next morning. Said sorrow's no use in a burning house." Clara's eyes stayed on the horizon. "Was she right?" He shrugged. "We made it. That's all I know." The next day a letter arrived from Boone. Clara didn't open it right away. She tucked it under the flour tin and stared at it for hours while scrubbing the floor, waiting for the bread to rise, mending the children's clothes. When she finally tore the envelope open, the words hit like a slap. Her husband's sister, Margaret, had gone to the county office. She'd written to a judge. Said Clara was keeping the children in unsafe conditions. That they had no education, no proper roof, no male figure to raise them. And the judge, comfortable and blind in some distant room, had signed the paper. A summons. A date. A warning. "They'll take them from me," Clara said that night, standing outside the livery. Her voice barely carried over the wind. "If I don't show proof of means. Land. A secure home." Matthew didn't speak. She turned on him, fists clenched. "I've done everything. Worked until my bones ache. Fed them with nothing but a pot and a prayer. I won't lose them to a woman who never held their hands through fever or stayed up all night listening for breath." He met her eyes, and something in his face cracked open. Not pity. Not fear. Something harder to name. "I'll go with you," he said. She blinked. What? I'll ride with you to Boone. Stand beside you. Why? He stepped forward, slow, measured. Because they're yours. Because you're theirs. And because if the law needs a man to say it, then I'll be that man. Her breath caught in her throat. You'd lie for me. No. I'd speak the truth they won't see. She looked at him then like she was seeing him for the first time. And maybe she was. He tipped his hat. We leave in 2 days. That night, Clara sat by the fire, her children sleeping in a heap beside her. The letter lay folded in her lap. She stared into the flames, eyes dry, heart pounding slow and heavy. Not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in a long while she wasn't alone. The ride to Boone took 3 days. They traveled light, 1 bag, a few biscuits wrapped in cloth, a change of clothes for the children. Matthew rode beside the wagon, reins loose in his hand, his eyes always scanning the horizon like he expected trouble. Clara drove the team, her shoulders tight back, straight as a fence post. The children were quiet most of the way. Even the youngest sensed something waited at the end of that road, something big and cold and final. The land changed as they rode. Hills flattened, trees thickened. The sky seemed smaller, the sun less fierce. On the 3rd morning they crested a ridge, and Clara saw Boone spread out below them, too neat and too clean. A town full of straight lines and tight lips. She hadn't been back since Sam's funeral. They reached the courthouse just after noon. Clara dressed the children in their cleanest clothes and wiped dust from their cheeks with the hem of her skirt. Her hands trembled as she braided her daughter's hair. Matthew stood at the foot of the stairs, still and unreadable. When she looked up at him, he gave one short nod. That was all. Inside, the judge was a thin man with round spectacles and a mustache like wilted straw. He read through the papers with the air of someone barely bothering. Margaret sat near the front in a stiff gray dress, her lips pressed thin. She didn't look at Clara, just at the children. The judge cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitlock, this court has reviewed the petition filed by Mrs. Margaret Cartwright regarding custody of your children. It states that your current living conditions are unsuitable and that you lack sufficient means to provide education, stability, or supervision. Is that correct? Clara stood. Her voice did not shake. That's what it says. It's not the truth. The judge raised an eyebrow. You have no property, no income, no husband. I have work, she said. I earn my keep. My children are fed and safe. They help me plant and tend and learn, and I have witnesses. He glanced at Matthew, who stepped forward without being asked. I run the livery in Willow's Rest, Matthew said. Name's Matthew Hayward. Mrs. Whitlock works beside me 6 days a week. She takes no charity, pays her debts in full. Her children are stronger than most boys I've seen come off ranches, and smarter. The judge frowned. Are you married? No, sir. And what is your relationship to Mrs. Whitlock? Matthew didn't blink. I hired her, and I intend to keep hiring her. Margaret stood then, voice sharp. He's lying for her. She's got no future out there. Just dirt and animals and a shack the wind could knock over. She's dragging those children into a life they didn't choose. Clara turned to her. And you think boarding school and stiff collars will give them something better? I think rules will. Clara's voice dropped low and fierce. They don't need rules. They need love. The judge leaned back, tapping his fingers on the desk. I've heard enough, he said after a long pause. This court does not find grounds for removal at this time. Mrs. Whitlock retains custody. Case dismissed. Clara let out a breath so deep it hurt her ribs. The children clung to her waist. Behind her, Matthew didn't move, but she could feel the tension ease from his shoulders like a rope uncoiling. Outside the courthouse, the sun had broken through the clouds. She turned to Matthew. "You didn't have to do that." "I know, but you did." He looked at her then, not like a man doing a favor, but like a man who'd made a decision. "We'll stop by the creek on the way back," he said. "Let the children see it." She smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't sweet. But it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. He touched the brim of his hat. "Always." That night they camped under cottonwoods near the water's edge. The fire snapped. Frogs sang low in the reeds. Clara sat beside him close, but not touching. She didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. The road home felt different. The air was warmer, the dust looser under the wagon wheels. Wildflowers lined the ditches, now yellow and white things swaying careless in the breeze. The children chased them when the wagons stopped to rest, their laughter ringing through the hills like it belonged there. Clara watched them run and knew what had shifted. Not just the law's decision, not just the journey's end, but something deeper, something inside her that had finally, after so many months of breaking, begun to heal. She looked over at Matthew riding a little ahead, his back straight, hand resting easy on the reins, that old brown hat shading his eyes. He hadn't said much since the courthouse, and he didn't need to. His presence was a kind of answer now, solid and quiet. That evening they reached Willow's Rest as the sun dipped low, throwing gold across the empty roofs. The shack stood waiting, small and weather-worn, but it was home. The garden had sprouted taller in their absence. Clara knelt beside the bean rows, her fingers brushing the leaves like they were children too. The soil smelled rich, honest. Matthew stayed as the children unpacked, helping unload the wagon, then hung back near the porch, not quite stepping away, not quite staying. "You could come in," she said, standing in the doorway. "Eat with us." He looked past her to where the children were gathering around the pot she had started to boil. "You sure?" he asked. "I wouldn't have asked if I wasn't." He came inside. It was cramped but warm. The children made room for him without hesitation. The oldest even offered him the seat near the fire. He declined it with a smile and sat on the floor like he'd done it 100 times. They ate in peace. Just stew and bread, but it filled every empty place that needed filling. Later, after the children had curled into sleep and the fire was down to coals, Clara and Matthew stepped outside. The stars were sharp and bright above the fields. The wind was soft now, whispering instead of howling. "You know," he said after a long silence, "I've been alone a long time." She looked at him, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "So have I. I never meant for it to stay that way." She nodded once. "Neither did I." He took a step closer, not touching, not pressing, just standing near enough to share the breath between them. "I'm not offering rescue," he said. "I know you don't need it." "What are you offering?" He met her eyes. "A place beside me. If you want it." She didn't answer right away. She looked up at the sky, then out toward the hills, then back to the doorway where her children slept. Then quietly, "I think I do." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small carved token, an old wooden horse, its legs worn smooth. "My mother gave me this the night she died," he said. "Told me to give it to someone worth staying for." He placed it in her palm. She held it tight, and when she looked back at him, her eyes were no longer afraid. They stood that way until the cold chased them inside. And in the morning, when the sun rose over Willow's Rest, it didn't rise on a widow and a stranger. It rose on something new, something whole. Subscribe and carry the story beyond the horizon.